Right. We are back with the amazing, incredible Kevin Zeese. I'm so excited to hear what he has to say. And he is the co-founder of he's on the board of the Courage Foundation. And I'll unmute you really fast, Kevin. Sorry, we're having a lot of technical difficulties today. How are you?
I'm sure it's challenging running this thing. I'm doing
yeah.
fine. Thanks for having me on.
So I know that you've been really involved in, the other events, including these online vigils, but I know that you were part of the demonstrations that took place on the 19th, and especially in front of the White House. What do you think has been the reaction to that? Do you think that it has built momentum in favor of Julian Assange? And also, what are your thoughts about the events that have happened since the last Unity 4J vigil?
Well, I think this has to be a campaign, and every step we take is a step in building the campaign and building the momentum to have Julian Assange released without any threat of prosecution, and that's the goal. The events in Washington, D.C., we did 2 events. One was at the White House, where people made presentations about why Donald Trump should take action to avoid prosecution of Julian Assange, and also people talked about why his case is important. Why it's important to democracy, why we need more transparency in government, and why this is like the case that will help to define freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and our right to information on the internet in the 21st century. So it's a critical case. After we did that, in the afternoon, we did another protest up at the British Embassy on Massachusetts Avenue. And the protest there was, of course, that's where Julian is being held under threat of incarceration if he leaves the Ecuadorean Embassy. And so we wanted to have that threat removed. The charges on which he was initially held no longer exist in Sweden. He's paid more than a fair price that any other accused would charge. He wasn't even accused; he was being held for investigation. Has had to pay for pre-trial release without bail, stuck in an embassy. So he's done his time, and it's time to let him out and stop the threats. It's very unclear what the United States has planned. There's been all sorts of reports of a secret indictment. We know that people have testified before a grand jury in Alexandria, Virginia, about Assange's case. There's supposedly a secret indictment, but it's not clear. It seems like maybe the Obama administration was unable to come up with an indictment because what Assange did was pretty much the same as what every major newspaper did as far as quoting WikiLeaks documents, and some newspapers partnering with WikiLeaks as documents were released. Seems like the Trump administration, the Sessions Department of Justice may have come up with kind of an accessory charge that in some way Julian did more than just be an editor and journalist, but helped Snowden to release the documents. I think that's going to be quite a stretch. I think it's not uncommon for reporters to find ways to acquire documents that are secret or classified, and that's happened many times before. No reporter's ever been charged with that. So it'd be an unusual stretch, but that's what they seem like they might have, at least according to press reports. We don't know. So momentum is starting to grow. These online events that you're helping to organize are getting big viewership and are part of helping grow that momentum. But we have to keep building it. We have to not be silent. We have to, people need to stand up and say, no, we believe in freedom of speech. We believe in our right to information. We oppose government transparency. We can't have freedom of speech without knowing what's going on. And so I think it's a really important fight. I'm glad to see it starting to develop.
So in addition to sharing and supporting vigils like this and the vigils that take place on the ground in front of the embassy, what are some of the ways that you feel people can help build that momentum that are watching and listening to this? What can they do?
Well, there's a big battle right now over control of the narrative. And it's very important for people who support Julian Assange, who support WikiLeaks, who support whistleblowers, who support government transparency, participate in a debate on social media, independent media, and where possible on the corporate mass media. And so people should be sending links out to this live Julian Assange Unity event. They should be sending links out to their lists. They should be sharing it with media outlets. They should be sharing it with government officials. They should be letting people know this is happening. And everyone's got to be encouraged to use their social media. People need to think of themselves as small media outlets. People have thousands of followers on various media outlets, and they should use that as a place to report what's going on. And they're very afraid of that, the people in the power structure.
Absolutely.
That social media has an impact. That if we work together and echo each other's claims, our writings, etc., that we actually have an influence on public opinion. And so we need to really overcome the character assassination that's been put on Julian Assange by the corporate mass media. And the only way to do that is with the people's media. And that's what this is really a conflict is about. That's what the whole Assange case is about. People's media, or monopolistic control of media by big business and big government.
Absolutely. And I know that some of our viewers will not have seen the last vigil, or they won't have seen your segment in the last vigil. So for the benefit of those listeners, could you please go over what you told us last time about the percentage of people needed with a national consensus to create a successful movement? Because I think that that was really inspiring for myself to hear, and I want to make sure that our audience today hears that from you.
Well, we just completed our first Popular Resistance School. If you go to popularresistance.org/school, you can review it. It's 8 classes on how social movements succeed, how they grow, what their tasks are, how they eventually win, what the various roles of people in movements are, and what the various roles of organizations are, as well as the obstacles we face. The effort to co-opt movements is very common. The effort to send in infiltrators and informants is very common. We have to know how to fight those things. So the question you're asking about is, what does it take for movement to win? And we're not starting understanding movements now. It's something that's been studied for more than 100 years. We've had a lot of experience on what movements fail, what movements succeed. And movements that win are movements that are mass movements. A fringe movement does not win. And by mass movement, what I mean is that we are representing the values and the views of a majority, and in the end, create a national consensus around that, those issues. And the issues that we are fighting for are economic, racial justice. We're fighting for environmental justice, as well as anti-imperialism and peace. All these issues that WikiLeaks has been very helpful on. And so we're in this phase right now. If you go watch our Popular Resistance School, you'll see that there are 8 phases of social movements. We're in that stage 7 is victory. Stage 6 is the stage we're in for many of the issues we're working on. We're on the verge of victory. Now that verge is not a quick victory. It's a slow process, because what we're doing at this stage is building national consensus. Once you build national consensus, then it takes only about 3.5% of people have always won when they're representing national consensus. 3.5% of the public that's mobilized in a democracy or a dictatorship has always won over the last 100 years of social movements. You can win at less, you can win at 1%, but at 3.5%, you never lose. Our guess is we're about 1% now. If you look at all the various fronts of struggle, from the climate change activists fighting pipelines and infrastructure, to the Black Lives Matter, to the fight for 15 and for a livable wage, for so many other issues. We think that during Occupy, we were about 1/10 of 1% back in 2011. 1/10 of 1%.
That's incredible.
You could see how even with that small number, the power structure was nervous. They were shaking. The Homeland Security and the FBI were holding weekly conference calls with police around the country. How did we deal with Occupy? They were sending in infiltrators and informants to undermine it, to monitor it, to send it off track. And we've documented all that with polls and surveys of occupiers to describe what happened in the various encampments. And so even with 1/10 of 1%, we were having a big impact. And Occupy accomplished its purpose. As the stage, I said there's 8 stages of successful social movements. Occupy is stage 4, known as the takeoff, when a movement suddenly erupts. And the movement was around inequality, corruption, racism, environmental disaster. All those issues were part of that movement. And it erupted nationwide. And unfortunately, the reality is that's only a tactic, camping out in public to raise an issue. That's not how you necessarily win, it's how you take off. And that's followed by the next stage, which is the landing. And so it disappears. Oh my God, it failed, disappeared. But it actually didn't fail. What it did was it brought people together, showed the people they were not alone, showed the public officials, the media, that there was a mass movement, people concerned about this inequality and corruption. And it leads to that next stage where we are now in majority level support. We've gone, wealth inequality was not even on the agenda, and now it is. So you go and with majorities of people on our side, recognizing we have to do something about wealth inequality, about the injustice of the economy, and a whole series of other issues. And so now we get to that next stage after the takeoff and landing, where we're in majority times. And the task right now is to build national consensus. And so whatever issues that you care about, whether it's healthcare and getting a national improved Medicare for all, whether it's getting a living wage so people can survive in this unfair economy, whether it's shrinking that wealth divide, whether it's housing for people who right now, if you earn the minimum wage in the United States, you can't afford to rent a house anywhere in the United States. Is that amazing?
Absolutely amazing. There are a lot of statistics floating around about I think the last one I saw that really struck me in that way was, it said, I think it was either 50% or 60% of Americans can't afford the basics like rent and food.
That sounds about right.
It's just stark. It's a stark situation.
What makes that more stark is there's more than enough money for that to happen. The problem is we've had this trickle-down economics for 50 years where we put money at the top through various tax breaks and corporate welfare and other devices. And the promise is they're going to trickle down on us and grow the economy. That hasn't worked. And so now we're at a point where 3 people have the wealth of half the population. So you talk about half the population not being able to afford the basics, not being able to afford rent or food. We have very high levels of poverty. Well, 3 people have wealth equal to that 50% of the population. So that's why they can't afford it. And they are so good at turning us against each other. You know, it's the immigrants.
Very true. Very true.
Attack the immigrants. And there's so many people who have these kind of racist and anti-ethnic views of people from Latin America. And it's a divide and conquer, divide and rule strategy of the elite to have us fighting each other rather than looking at where the money really is. But I think people are getting it. People are catching on. And so we really have the task of developing a national consensus around these issues. And the consensus has to be around 3 questions. The first question is there a problem? I think we have national consensus on that. There's a whole series of problems, and they are crisis problems.
Definitely.
28,000 people dying each year because they don't have health insurance, and tens of thousands more dying because they have inadequate health insurance. That's a crisis. When no one can afford to rent in the country, that's a crisis. So when youth are leaving college with high levels of debt, so they can't even afford to move out of their parents' house, or have to live in a roommates type situation, can't afford to, certainly can't afford to buy a house. That's a crisis situation. And our whole foreign policy, never-ending war, is another crisis. So the first question is there a problem? We have a yes on that. The second question is, will more of the same solve the problem? And the answer obviously is no. And I think people recognize that if we keep doing the same thing that we've been doing, funneling money to the top, using insurance industry for our healthcare, on issue allowing police to be brutal and racist in their enforcement without any supervision, any community control. These aren't going to solve the problem. So the second question, more of the same will not work. So the third question is the key one. Are you ready for alternatives? Will you listen to alternatives? And I think we go through specific issues. We're certainly have majority support on many alternatives: taxing the wealthy, single-payer health care, living wage, confronting climate change, ending racist policing. There's majority support on all that. We want to get beyond just majority support into supermajority, over 60%, and even to national consensus, over 80 or 85%. We're getting to that net neutrality. We're at 90%, including Republican support for net neutrality. So on some issues, we are getting toward that consensus. And once you get toward that national consensus, we just need a small percentage of the public, under 3%, to be active and mobilized, and we will win. We see the 2020s as a transformative decade because the movement is growing to the right point where it's going to have the people power to make change. The crises issues are getting to the point where they can't be ignored anymore, and it's obvious the government can't solve them. And so those are the ingredients for transformative change. But we have to do the work, and that's why we did the Popular Resistance School at popularresistance.org/school, because we think there has to be a movement of movements that is filled with leaders. We need the creativity of leaders around the country and throughout the country, using their own creativity, working with their local people, their own networks to do parts of this struggle. When you have a well-organized and well-educated group of people who are ready to help lead their communities, then you can start to have a national movement that becomes unpredictable and unstoppable. And that's where we're going in the 2020s. It's going to be a transformative decade if we do the work right now to get the truth out.
Absolutely agree. And I think that I'd also like to ask you where you think, just on the issue of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, we stand right now. And I understand, that we're probably, a good ways behind the other issues you've just discussed. But what do you think is the most pressing, barrier that we have to cross to get that momentum going and to see that type of national consensus built in support of WikiLeaks?
Well, you can never tell how close you are to victory. We may be much closer than we think on Julian Assange. We don't know we're always hitting a wall, and a wall remains dense, and you can't see through it, so you don't know how thick that wall is. And then when you keep hitting at it, and a crack of light comes through, you're getting close. And usually by the time you see that, you're on the verge of victory. So we might be close to that crack. Who knows? There have been reports that there were negotiations that were moving in favor of having Assange released without charges, and they fell apart. How close and why, we don't know the answer to that. So I think we are. I think that we are with the WikiLeaks case, with Julian Assange's case, we are on the side of the beliefs of the people in a freedom of the press, in freedom of speech, into the right to know, into government being more transparent. Those are all very popular issues. I mean, they are, like, in some ways, you say freedom of press, freedom of speech are kind of like the myths of the United States that were built on. People believe that. They want a free press. They want free speech. They want information on the internet.
Absolutely.
So we're all on that side. So we are building from that. And I think what we have to begin to do, I think our job as supporters of Julian Assange and of WikiLeaks, is we have to really show the public why the work that Assange has done as editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks is consistent with those beliefs, those ideals. And I think we also need to go back and rebuild his character after the assassination that he suffered with those Swedish sex investigations that have now been stopped, that were always very questionable. And I think so we have to rebuild his personal character, but we really have to, I think most important, is show why what he was doing was consistent with the best ideals of the United States. So they're consistent with the best ideals of a real democracy where people have the information to make decisions, and why his work was really essential. You can't have a democracy without transparency. And Julian Assange really made that point really clearly. He exposed things that the people of the United States needed to know. We needed to know that the NSA was spying on us. We needed to know that the war crimes that were being committed in Iraq. We needed to know how Guantanamo Bay was being handled, and how the Afghanistan war is being handled, and how the State Department under Hillary Clinton and John Kerry were really departments for transnational corporate interests, working on their behalf rather than on our behalf and on behalf of world security. So I think the job that WikiLeaks did was so critical. So I think it's our job as activists to get out the truth about the work that Julian Assange did as editor and publisher of WikiLeaks, as one of the most, I think, important journalists of this century. He's exposed more important stories than I can't think of any individual or outlet that's done as much as Julian Assange WikiLeaks have. So I think we have to really build that up, let people see that. And I think Donald Trump needs to be reminded that throughout his campaign, he talked about WikiLeaks in very positive ways. And I think he now needs to take action to ensure that Julian Assange can leave that embassy without threat of prosecution.
Absolutely. And I think what you just said reminds me of an opinion editorial that Julian Assange wrote. I believe it was published with the Washington Post, but in any case, it basically was saying something that you brought up, which is that, maybe some people have perceived Assange's work to indicate some sort of dislike of America, but to the contrary, as you said, he was living up to American ideals about freedom of the press, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what he said. He actually wrote, far from hating America, I idealize America. And I think it's it just needs to actually walk its walk, walk its talk, I suppose. So I think that is something that people need to remind themselves of, that he's doing exactly what America should encourage people to do.
Why is it a crime to expose the truth?
Exactly.
Especially about government in a democracy. I would think that would be patriotic.
Absolutely.
If we don't like what we see, we still need to see it. We still need to know what the government's doing in our name, and what they, we know. One of the big tactics of the people in power, the power holders, is that they will tell us one narrative about what they're doing, and then in reality be doing another story. They'll tell us a false narrative that people can support, and then they will not tell us about what they're really doing, which people would oppose. And we see that all the time. And I think a lot of the WikiLeaks publications and articles and the government documents they published really go right to that point. Truth versus reality. What is really happening versus what they're telling us. And in fact, even one of the emails from Hillary Clinton, where she admitted having a public face and a private face, and so that is the way government operates. I know when we were doing the Trans-Pacific Partnership campaign to stop that corporate trade agreement that was being negotiated in secret, the ambassador who was in charge of U.S. trade, the U.S. trade representative, told me that the reason they were keeping it secret was because they knew if the public knew what was in it, it would never become law. Well, that's exactly how democracy is supposed to work. If it won't become law because the public will oppose it, it shouldn't become law. And so if you have to keep it secret in order to do it, and that's true on a lot of different fronts, then we have a problem. I think someone like Julian Assange and the work of WikiLeaks, which has also been duplicated by other outlets now, is essential to having a real democracy. So WikiLeaks should be applauded. Julian Assange should be recognized as taking patriotic action to tell the truth. And people who criticize him should be recognized as people who are trying to hide the truth. And we should inquire why they're trying to hide it. What is it they don't want us to know that Julian Assange is telling us?
Absolutely. And so often, whether it's WikiLeaks, whether it's Chelsea Manning, whether it's John Kiriakou, it seems that the people that are punished the most are the truth tellers, who are living up to that patriotic sense of American free speech and transparency and the people's right to know, just as you say. So it's very, very saddening and telling that our most patriotic truth tellers are punished the most by the state. It's extremely worrying.
It's a serious misuse of government authority, and President Obama was among the worst. He did more to prosecute whistleblowers than any previous president. He used those clauses in statutory law that were never used over and over again to go after whistleblowers. And unfortunately, Donald Trump is the same. And so we have work to do to recognize that whistleblowers' voices need to be heard, that their rights need to be protected. They shouldn't be punished for telling the truth about government or big business activities. And I think that's why I've said over and over again that Julian Assange's case is the John Peter Zenger case of the 21st century. John Peter Zenger was a publisher who was prosecuted before the American Revolution, and he was prosecuted because he published articles that were critical of the British appointed governor of New York. He published articles, multiple articles, and they weren't false, they were just critical. And in those days, slander didn't require, there was no defense to slander as far as telling the truth goes. You said something bad with the government, you say something bad with the king, you get punished for it. Doesn't matter if it's true or not. And so Zenger, in his defense, his lawyers decided to use a defense that had not been used before, which was to go right to the jury, avoid the judge, go right to the jury, and show how what Zenger was publishing was the truth. And Zenger was found not guilty very quickly by a jury after being held in jail for 8 months without a trial, and his first lawyer being stopped from defending him by the judge. He had to get a second lawyer, and all sorts of, being a very big cause célèbre because of the way they were abusing him while he was under arrest and being denied counsel. And so went to the jury, and the jury very quickly found not guilty. And that, people really see that case as where a lot of our freedom of the press rights come from. And the concept that truth is a defense comes from that case. And really, Julian Assange is revisiting that issue now in the 21st century, when we have a whole lot of different kind of technology that allows for truth to be told. And he and WikiLeaks created the technology that allowed people to blow the whistle on government or on corporations and do it anonymously by sharing documents anonymously with WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks would then review the documents, verify that they're accurate and true and real, and then publish them. And that was a very major breakthrough in how journalism works and what information we as readers or as citizens are allowed to see. We're now, we should know many of the things that Assange published that were kept secret should not have been secret. And many people, including President Obama, and many others who are in the mainstream, say we overclassify in this country. We classify way more than what needs to be secret. And so I think there's nothing that Assange did that hurt any person working for the United States. But they did expose corruption. They did expose behavior that was not acceptable to most people. And that's what they're upset about. They don't want the truth to be known. They want to be able to get away with acting secretly against what the interests of the people of the United States are and the people of the world are. And I think WikiLeaks is a threat to that. So silencing Assange as he's silent right now, where he's not allowed internet access or allowed visitors other than his lawyers, that has to change. It's unacceptable that the most important publisher and editor in this century is now silenced. And I think our job as activists is to get that idea out there. That whether you like Assange or not personally, the work he's done is critical to our future. It's critical to us knowing what our government is doing so we as people in a democracy can influence the direction of the government.
I completely agree, and I think I think I discussed with a couple of guests yesterday the fact that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and everybody that works with WikiLeaks deserve massive amounts of credit that they never get in the media, but for the careful way in which they not only verify that their documents are completely foolproof, valid, legitimate documents, but they also carefully go through these hundreds of thousands, if not millions of files to make sure that they do redact the names that need to be redacted, and also with Vault 7 to make sure they weren't publishing like basically live weapons as versions of malware. So they specifically said in their press release for that we have held back some, that information which could be harmful. And I think that type of careful editing is absolute proof, first of all, that WikiLeaks is a journalistic outlet, and second of all, it's something that people do not give them credit for. And I think that is a huge shame, because they must put so much work into that type of vetting.
I think that's so important, because we know from various documents, like a program called Palantir, that was going to actually send journalists and other WikiLeaks and other outlets false documents to try to catch them and have them publish those and say, "See, you're a liar." It's kind of amazing that with that kind of campaign going at them, WikiLeaks has been able to avoid any lies, has been able to avoid any publication of fake or false documents. And I think that shows exactly what you say, that the WikiLeaks is journalism. That the publisher is careful about what is made public. The editor reviews to make sure that people aren't harmed and that active secrets aren't released that are relevant to national security. They take steps like that. Now, of course, the Pompeos of the world would want everything secret. And so even when you take steps to avoid problems for intelligence agencies and the military, still just telling the truth about what they do is enough of a problem to them, and is a great benefit to us. And so that's why I think his case is so important, and why we should really all be putting time and effort in to free Julian Assange. It should be one of the priorities, I think, of this time. I think we're going to a point now, the Ecuadorians have said that Julian's stay in the embassy is not forever. That's pretty scary. What does that mean? And so I think we're going to a stage now where we could see Assange forced out of the embassy and into the arms of the UK legal authorities, potentially held without bail, and then potentially extradited to the United States. All that is possible. But we can avoid all that if we do our jobs and organize to stop it. And so that's why this kind of effort and the on-the-ground efforts around the world have been important. We have to keep doing them. We have to keep building them, because more is needed. I really am thankful to people like Angel Fox, who's the activist online for WikiLeaks that helped to organize the DC protest. Trevor Fitzgibbon, who's a progressive media expert, who helped us to make sure we got media attention to that, and so many other people who participated in these protests around the world. In the United States, it takes lots of people to make things like this happen, and many people don't get recognition for it, and they deserve recognition, because what people are doing is really very important, very patriotic, and important to the future of the country as a democracy that recognizes freedom of speech and freedom of press, which have been whittled away. I think this is an opportunity actually to rebuild them, to make them even stronger than they were after 2 centuries of the United States weakening those protections, various court decisions along the way. Now it's time for us to say, no, we really do want a real freedom of speech. We really do want a real free press. And punishing somebody for telling the truth, for releasing legitimate, real documents that tell the truth, that is not a crime. And that should become the future for the United States. Just like Zenger created the future of freedom of the press and the truth as a defense, well, now we have to have a defense of transparency and internet freedom. And the Assange case, I hope, moves us in that direction. I think the Assange defense that people like you and I and others are involved in will help us in that direction no matter what happens in this case. Every time we do something like this, we are continuing to build and push a movement for transparency, for real freedom of speech and real freedom of the press in the 21st century. And so every one of these steps in defending Assange is a positive step. And if we're successful in defending Assange, which I think we will be, then it'll be even a more important step forward.
Absolutely. And I think, listening to that, what it reminds me of is not only should WikiLeaks be supported for what it does and the amazing amount of work that it does to vet its documents, but if they were to somehow, if they were to not exist tomorrow, hypothetically, I could not imagine the New York Times, the Washington Post, or any other respected legacy press outlet going through the trouble to accurately vet that volume of information. I don't think any other organization would do that or be capable of it.
Well,
I
expect their vetting would be much worse. They would just not publish those kinds of documents.
Exactly.
Because they have very strong contacts with the CIA, with the NSA, with the Pentagon, the State Department, and the White House and Congress, that they will be convinced by the power structure not to release documents that expose important truths that the people should know. They will continue to overclassify and keep secret. And so I think someone like Assange, who has the courage to stand up to U.S. empire and take the risk that he's been taking, is essential. Because I don't think an organization like the New York Times, which was so famous for putting forth the false weapons of mass destruction story that got us into the Iraq War, I don't think that a publication like that is likely to tell the truth. I don't think the Washington Post, owned by the world's richest person, is likely to tell the truth. So I think something like Assange, which is much more people-powered, popular media, is where we're going to get that truth from, and not this corporate media that's concentrated and controlled by the power structure.
Absolutely. And I think that although it really is stating the obvious that those outlets that are so interrelated with the unelected power structure would not do what WikiLeaks does, I think it bears reminding and remembering that, because I think people sometimes take WikiLeaks for granted, and they fall into the debating whether or not this or that propaganda narrative is valid about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And I think that reframing that and the way we speak about that, I think, is really important and one of the products of these vigils.
I think one thing we have to do also is to call out the corporate media for failing to defend Assange. They use the WikiLeaks publications in their reporting, but when Julian Assange is under attack, they don't come to defend him. They remain silent. For the most important freedom of the press case of our times, they're silent. I think the reason for that is because there's a big conflict going right now between concentrated corporate media of the power structure and the diverse and dispersed independent and social media of the people's media. And I think that conflict, Assange is on the people's media side. The corporate media side does not want to be overtaken. Corporate media already has such problems with credibility. People just do not trust the corporate media. People trust social media because they're getting information from their friends and their families and their neighbors. They trust that more. And the corporate media is also having a problem with viewership and readership and funding. And so the rise of the social media, the rise of WikiLeaks as one of the top investigative media outlets in the world, the rise of international media like RT and Chinese news and Latin American news from Telesur, the rise of all those sources is a threat because we can see the truth. Even something as simple as YouTube is a threat to the corporate media because so often videos show the truth in ways that the corporate media cannot create a false narrative around. There's no question Eric Garner was killed by the police because we saw a video showing it. There's no question that the Israeli military was shooting to kill unarmed protesters in Gaza. We saw the videos over and over again. They just massacred people. They're they're showing why Israel probably doesn't even deserve to exist as a country at that point. Israel is showing itself, and people are seeing it. And that is not the U.S. media's line. The U.S. media, when they describe what happened to Israel, is very different from what we see in the video. And so media narrative is a big battle. It's a battle that every person watching this can be part of and should be part of. It's very prominent in the issues we must confront, and we can confront it not just by criticizing it, by being our own media. And so, as I said earlier, people need to think of themselves as a media outlet. They need to take on these issues like the Assange case, this video, and share this kind of a live stream, share this when it's a video after the live stream is over, so more and more people are aware of it and can rally around it, can join the campaign to get Julian Assange released from the embassy without any threat of prosecution.
I completely agree. And I think that, you know, although it may seem slow, I agree with you that this is making a difference. I do feel that it's growing momentum. And I think that, and I hope that the powers that be understand this, that the longer Julian Assange is isolated, the more backlash there is, and the more obvious they make the situation that he is a persecuted political prisoner and not somebody who's in there to hide from, a sexual assault investigation that has been dropped almost a year ago. So I hope that there is enough backlash to make the power structure understand that it's against their interest to be so overt in their efforts to silence him. I don't know.
They have to see that treating this political prisoner the way they are, treating Julian Assange the way they are, hurts them. It hurts their credibility. It hurts Donald Trump from his campaign of support for Assange. Now he's silent on it. That hurts his credibility with his followers. The media needs to know that it hurts their credibility when they remain silent on the important issue of Assange's freedom to be a publisher and editor. And they use his documents and then don't help defend them. They need to realize that they'll be next. And so we have to get people coming together in unity, in a movement of movements, because what Assange has released, the WikiLeaks, affects all of the aspects of the social movements that we're in, whether it's environmental justice, trade justice, weapons and war, the genocide and ethnic cleansing in Israel, the economic realities in the United States, the corporate power that controls our government and controls our foreign policy, all these issues. WikiLeaks and Julian Assange have been in the forefront. And so we have to realize he's a political prisoner because he has challenged the power structure. And now that power structure needs to be shamed. So they lose support. They lose credibility if they continue to treat Assange in this way. It's time for Assange to be released. It's time for threats against him to be stopped. It's time for Julian Assange to begin again to focus his efforts on his important task of building transparency, of bringing us transparency to government action.
I completely agree. And I think that, you know, the element of that I think needs to happen much more is, as you said, the shaming of these authorities for what they're doing. I think we're finally reaching a point where that can happen because it's so clear to any even remotely neutral observer that the Swedish investigation obviously has nothing to do with the way Assange is being treated right now. And so I think that this is now the time when we can begin to hopefully see that mass sort of shaming of the establishment in what it's doing to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange.
It's amazing that Swedish investigation had as much impact as it did. It was like so obvious from the beginning to be a phony investigation. That multiple prosecutors first rejected the investigation. After they talked to Assange and talked to the woman, they decided not to pursue it. They finally found a prosecutor willing to pursue it, and she was a political prosecutor, and she took it on and let it sit there for years. She could have gone to the embassy at any time to interview Assange. She refused to do so. She wanted that to drag on because that kept Assange captive. It kept Assange in a situation where he had no choice but to stay in that embassy. It made his work more difficult, and now he's still stuck there. And so those Swedish charges, and you look at the connections of some of the women involved to the Cuban CIA activity. It's just like, what? You're trusting this? And they didn't even want, they're remaining silent for the most part. So it's just a bizarre situation. So yeah, we need to correct that, and because that's a misimpression still out there. There are still women in the United States who think Assange is guilty of some kind of sexual abuse or even rape when he's not even been charged with any crime. So we have still to correct that. But really the most important thing is to focus on the work Assange does.
Absolutely.
How important it's been, how impactful it's been, how it's covered every issue that the movement is working on. So the movement for economic, racial, environmental justice and peace needs to get behind Julian Assange. And if we do, we will pull the establishment to get behind him as well, because it'll become impossible for them to say they're on the wrong side of this injustice.
Absolutely. And I've been really impressed, especially over the last couple of months. Some of the World Socialist website and a number of associated groups around the world have shown huge solidarity demonstrations for Assange. And I think that's really encouraging to see that segment of the population sort of waking up and driving a message that is pro WikiLeaks and pro Julian Assange, because it really shows the lie of corporate establishment Democrats and corporate establishment talking head pundits who portray Assange as somehow in alliance with some sort of crazy alt-right faction. When we see so clearly the reality is the complete opposite, I think that helps a lot. And I'm really grateful to have seen the World Socialist website really, really publicizing everything that's going on with Assange in the last few months.
Well, the World Socialist website is an excellent site for all sorts of information, so I recommend it highly to people. And they've done a very good job on the issue of Julian Assange and covering the movement against it. We had someone speaking at both events in Washington, D.C. from the World Socialist website, a young writer. She spoke about it, and so I think that's one segment of many that needs to be out in front on this. And so we really appreciate them and others who are starting to step up. But please, share this live stream. Please let people know about this campaign. Get involved in whatever way you can, and recognize your role as a member of the social media to take this issue on.
Absolutely. I think that advice cannot be taken you can't overstate the importance of that message. We've got about 12 minutes left in this segment. Are there any thoughts? And I know that Susie's mentioned this before. We don't know whether Assange will ever be able to watch this stream, but if he can you please what would you want to say to Julian Assange if he could see this?
Well, if I were in Julian Assange's shoes, what I want to know is that people are rallying to my defense. It must feel very lonely inside an embassy with people cut off from you. You're not able to hear people's voices, see supporters, or be on the internet to see if there's support. So he must feel pretty isolated and alone. And I want him to know that there are millions of people who want his freedom and are doing what they can for his freedom, and that we're not going to stop. That his freedom is an essential ingredient for not just him, but for our futures. And so I want Assange to know he's supported and appreciated, that he's not alone, and that his difficult situation is helping to create a movement for real freedom in the 21st century. Freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom to gather information, and more transparency in government. All those issues that he fought for when he was allowed to speak are still being fought for. And when he gets out, he'll be able to pick up where he left off, and he'll have a lot of people behind him. He won't be alone. He'll have a lot of people who are very supportive, and so he'll even be stronger when he gets through this. And he will get through it. I don't see how this can last. If he is even forced to leave the embassy and go into the UK, he will fight that bail issue, I think, quite well, particularly now that the Swedish investigation has been stopped. Extradition can be fought well. Any charges that come to the United States can be fought well. So I think on all these fronts, he has a chance of victory. So how this turns out, I think, is going to be an Assange victory. And it's going to be a victory for the movement for freedom of the press in the 21st century. So I hope he's feeling strong about that. I know he's not hearing us. I wish he could, but I really would like him not to feel like he's alone, but that he's surrounded by people who are working on his behalf.
Absolutely, extremely true. And I believe that John Kiriakou and Kieran O'Reilly both in the previous Vigil emphasized the impact of letters that they received while they were isolated. And we haven't really discussed that as much in this Vigil, but I'm always assuming that some of our viewers have not seen the previous Vigils and the live stream. So do you have any thoughts on the impact of letter writing, postcards, and that type of contact to keep the tether to humanity tied for Julian while he is isolated?
Yeah, I think, are they only allowing postcards? Is that right? I think you have to.
I know that I think it's okay to send letters. I know postcards are encouraged. I think that some people have sent letters just fine without them being returned.
I would definitely recommend people do that. I think that's the only connections allowed for Julian to have to the outside world. We need to strengthen that connection. And so I think a letter writing campaign to Julian would be a good campaign to pursue. Maybe we should pursue that as one of our next projects. I think the letter writing campaign would let him know that he's not alone. It would let the Ecuadorian Embassy that would deliver the mail see that he's not alone. I don't know what's happening with Ecuador right now. It's really a shame the direction it's going on a number of fronts, including this one. And so I think it's important for that embassy, that country, to know that the people of the world on the side of Julian Assange want to see him treated fairly, want to see him protected from abusive prosecution. But yeah, I highly recommend writing to Julian Assange. I think it would be great for him to hear from you, and to know that would let him know that he's not alone in this difficult situation. Very
Definitely. Important. So we just have a few minutes left. Are there any issues surrounding WikiLeaks or Julian Assange that we haven't covered, or any future events that you want to discuss in the last few minutes of this segment?
I think we've covered a lot. I think I just want to emphasize to people the importance of this as to the future of democracy. I literally believe that if the media is suppressed by Assange being successfully prosecuted, it would have a major impact on the future of our democracy. Free media has always been essential to democracy. You can't have freedom of speech if the public doesn't know what's actually going on. You can't have democracy without an informed public. And so freedom of press is kind of a foundational ingredient. I know my work as a movement activist that in any campaign that we pursue, the first step is education. And so education is exactly what WikiLeaks is all about, getting the truth out. And so they provide us, the people, in the people's media, with our own social media outlets. WikiLeaks provides us with the tools to influence the direction of the country and the world. And so I think I hope people will recognize the importance of this, not just because of the injustice of Julian Assange as a political prisoner, but to the injustice to all of us in denying transparency and allowing secrets that even involve some of the most serious war crimes that can occur. And so this is an issue for all of us, not just for Julian. So I really urge you to put this on their agenda of things they are working on, and look for opportunities when something comes across the media that is positive, that's helpful, to make you spread that and use that to influence more people to get involved. We need to build a consensus that Julian Assange is one of the most important reporters in the 21st century, and that he should be released without any threat of prosecution. And so his work as editor and publisher of WikiLeaks can continue. It's essential, not just for Julian, but for all of us and for future generations.
I completely agree. And thank you so much, Kevin, for joining us. It's been amazing to speak with you again. It's always an honor to hear what you have to say. And thank you on behalf of all of the audience, not only for appearing on these vigils, but also for your active participation in the demonstrations in front of the White House on the 19th. I know that really impacted a lot of people to see all of those rallies and demonstrations of solidarity. So thank you. And
Thank you for
and
having me on. I appreciate the work that you all are doing as well. So we're all in this together. Let's keep it moving forward together.